Will Falcons linebackers Troy Andersen and Kaden Ellis each reach their high ceilings in 2023, or will it be another year of disappointing Falcons linebacker play?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and, of course, the very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And we thank each and every one of you that makes this illustrious podcast your first listen. Shout out to the everydayers who subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, and you should do the same so that you can get the latest episode as soon as it is available. We are continuing our series looking at each position group for the Atlanta Falcons, turning our attention to the Falcons off-ball linebackers on today's episode. And I know I've heard people express concerns about the sort of unproven nature of the Falcons, linebacker core heading into the season. And I get that to a certain extent, but my spicy take of the day is, the Falcons really haven't had good linebacker play for like 2 decades. You'd have to go back to like the early 2000s when both Keith Brooking and Chris Draft were here, or to the 90s when it was Tuggle and Cornelius Bennett, before you had to go back to find 2 good linebackers on the Falcons. Like, they've had good linebackers on the team, but it's rarely been more than one. Like, you go from Michael Boley to Spoon to Deion Jones to Foye Oluokun, but like very few of those years, those good years, overlapped with various players, and you had a lot of middling linebacker play. So for me, when I look at this group and sort of its unproven nature, I sit here and I go, what else is new? Like, this is the same old. Like, this is not any different to me than what the Falcons linebacker core has mostly been for the last 15 years, except for, I guess, in previous years, you at least had one guy, for the most part, most years, that you felt really good about. And, we'll talk about, which of the guys you feel really good about. For me, that's probably Kaden Ellis, but I'm sure others, may differ on that. But, let's talk a little bit about Troy Andersen, who I think has a lot of intriguing potential. And I'm very eager to see what Troy Andersen's development looks like over the course of this season, because I do think when we talk about the floor and the ceiling for a player's potential this upcoming season, you could argue that Troy Andersen's floor and ceiling have maybe the widest disparity between those 2 points, and how good he could potentially be, as well as how bad he could potentially be in his first full year as a starter. And, that stems from the fact that the Falcons took a pretty big swing on Troy Andersen in round 2, betting on his traits and his upside, taking him over several more pro-ready linebackers, and maybe the Falcons pay for that. But, Andersen was a raw prospect coming out of Montana State. Played quarterback, running back prior to making the permanent switch to linebacker in 2020. And when I watched the film of his from Montana State, I had major question marks about his physicality, his instincts, his technique, right? And the biggest one being that physicality, that toughness, right? Because I think instincts and technique can be developed, right? I don't think physicality really can, at least not at the NFL level, right? You either got it at this point in time when you're 22, 23, whatever, or you don't, right? And now I think with Troy Andersen, the pleasant thing from his rookie season, it was an up and down year, but to me, the physicality, the toughness was the non-issue. He checked that box. So that's good. And now it's going to be the questions about his instincts and his technique moving forward. The instincts mostly referring to his ability to make reads and recognize things, right? His technique mostly about, taking on, leveraging blocks so that, being able to shed those blockers and whatnot. And I think that's going to be a big point of emphasis for this coaching staff, because we already know under new defensive coordinator Ryan Nielsen, we're going to play with lighter boxes. That means, 6-man boxes. And when you're trying to stop the run with 6 guys, it's really important that those guys are, disciplined and sound with their run fits, right? And it kind of goes back to a conversation we had earlier this week with Eddie Goldman and sort of his value to this football team. And I think Eddie Goldman and Troy Andersen's success may potentially go hand in hand, right? Because having a big space-eating nose tackle like Eddie Goldman could be very valuable to taking pressure off of Troy Andersen. That means he can take on less of those blocks. That means he can afford to be maybe a half step late, recognizing and reading things out because he's kept clean by a player like Eddie Goldman. So I think those two guys kind of go hand in hand. If both of those guys, if one has success, then the other one should have success in a lot of ways, especially Eddie Goldman compared to Troy Andersen. But I think overall, my expectations for Troy Andersen this year, there's going to be ups and downs, and it wouldn't shock me at all if there's more downs than ups this upcoming season. And we talk about this every year when we're breaking down each Falcons draft class and when talking about the floor and the ceiling of each prospect, and talk about how the floor is going to often more be determine what a player is early in their career. And you really won't need to worry about the ceiling for a player, for most players, until the third, fourth, fifth year is when they have the potential to reach that point. And so clearly we're more concerned about the floor for Troy Andersen this year heading into this season. But I'm mostly fine with Troy Andersen if he is inconsistent because that relatively low floor, right? Despite the fact that myself and I'm sure most of you listening have playoff aspirations for this football team, the Falcons are still technically in a rebuild. It's, they're entering phase 2 of a 3-phase process, and growing pains to me are part of phase 2. And that includes Troy Andersen. And hopefully, we'll get to years in and we'll see that progress and that growth from Troy Andersen to the point that when we're doing Q&As and mailbags late in the season, you guys are asking me like, hey, Troy Andersen's put together a couple of good games. Are we now in phase 3 when it comes to Troy Andersen? So hopefully we'll get to that point, but we'll just sort of have to see. But again, there's a fairly wide disparity between Troy Andersen's floor and the ceiling. Linebacker is a position I think tends to get undervalued, myself included, right? I think a lot of people look at linebacker as kind of the running back of defense, where, kind of an average player is kind of a dime a dozen type of player. And there, you can make the argument that an average linebacker is less valuable than an average player at pretty much any other position on defense. However, I do think when you have a really good linebacker or a really bad linebacker, you're going to be able to tell. It's going to have a major impact on your defense, right? And that's going to be the question with Troy Andersen. Is he going to be a subpar linebacker, or is he going to be a very good linebacker? And I think, with time, with development, I think he has the potential to be a very good linebacker. But I certainly think if he does struggle this year, it will be very noticeable to a lot of folks, watching the games each and every Sunday. So we'll see how that all plays out for Troy Andersen. We'll continue the conversation talking about Kaden Ellis, his potential, especially when it comes to rushing the quarterback, as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Guys, I want to tell you about our partners at eBay Motors, who have teamed up with Locked On Fantasy Football host Vinny Iyer to bring you some of the best fantasy picks each week, all season long. Whether you're prepping for the draft or scouting the waiver wire, every week we're going to provide you players that are guaranteed to fit your roster. So with draft prep underway for the upcoming season, let's see who Vinny has picked out for us in this week's eBay's Guaranteed Fit Fantasy Picks of the Week. When making the first overall selection in your upcoming fantasy drafts, 49ers running back Christian McCaffrey is a guaranteed fit. A healthy McCaffrey is guaranteed to see well more than 300 touches, and again in his first full season in San Francisco as the centerpiece of the 49ers offensive engine. McCaffrey checks all the boxes, including his talent, his usage, his floor, and his ceiling. Run with CMC as a guaranteed fit at number 1 for a smooth ride to another year of big numbers. And Vinny Iyer of Locked On Fantasy Football is going to help you win your fantasy championship. And eBay Motors knows a championship team is about each player being a perfect fit. Same with your vehicle. With eBay Guaranteed Fit and over 122 million parts and accessories for your vehicle right at your fingertips, you can make sure your ride stays running smoothly. Air filters, brakes, batteries, taillights, alternators, shock struts, you name it, eBay Motors has it, and they'll make sure it's the right fit for your car, because eBay Guaranteed Fit helps you understand exactly what part you need for your vehicle the first time. So go forth, switch gears, crank the AC, and say goodbye to sweating if your ride needs a little fixing up, because now you'll always be set up for success from the get-go with eBay Guaranteed Fit. Everything your vehicle is calling for is just a click away. For the parts and accessories that fit your vehicle, just look for the green check. Get the right parts, the right fit, the right prices at ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay guaranteed fit, only available to U.S. customers, eligible items only, exclusions apply. So continuing today's conversation, talking about Kaden Ellis, the other linebacker next to Troy Andersen. Ellis is interesting because I think expectations for him are kind of all over the place, because I think a lot of that stems from the fact that a lot of people had never even heard of Kaden Ellis when the Falcons first signed him, which was kind of evident because for like the next several weeks and months, still people were kind of considering him to be an edge rusher than a true off-ball linebacker. But, every dayers here on Locked On Falcons knew about Kaden Ellis weeks ahead of when the Falcons signed him. We talked about him extensively on sort of my defensive free agent wish list episode about 2 weeks before the Falcons wind up signing him. So shout out to the everydayers that, I know about Kaden Ellis because Aaron's, spent 7 minutes talking about him on the podcast. But, for those of you that miss that episode 2 weeks prior to the Falcons signing him, the Cliff/Spark Notes or whatever they're called now on Kaden Ellis is that he was a former college defensive end that converted to an off-ball linebacker when he was drafted by the Saints a couple of years ago. Spent 3 years as a backup and special teams player for the Saints, backing up all three spots in New Orleans at Sam, Mike, and Will linebacker. And the past year, this in 2022, due to an injury to their starting Will linebacker and Pete Warner, Kaden Ellis got some early action as an injury replacement, played well. And then when Warner was healthy in the second half of the season, the Saints still wanted to carve out a regular role for Kaden Ellis in their lineup, primarily as a pass rusher because of his value there. And he was very impactful as a pass rusher in the second half of the season, sort of usurping Demario Davis as the team's main pass rushing linebacker on those simulated pressures the Saints love to run. And that's notable because Demario Davis is arguably one of the 2 or 3 best pass rushing off-ball linebackers in the NFL. And the fact that the Saints thought so highly of Kaden Ellis that he's even better than that speaks to Kaden Ellis's ability and that background as a collegiate pass rusher. And he was very productive in that role, often in, getting production in the form of stunts, right? Got 6 sacks in those final 9 games of 2022. And expectations for Kaden Ellis here in Atlanta is he's going to play basically the exact same role that he had last year in New Orleans. He's going to be the starting Will linebacker for the Falcons this year, that weak side inside linebacker. And he's going to be one of their primary pass rushers on the simulated pressures that you're going to see the Falcons run a ton of, often in the form of stunts. And I think Kaden Ellis has a lot of potential to be productive in that role. In fact, he has 10 sack potential in that role. We talked about that earlier this offseason on the podcast, and that stems from just looking at his production in those final 9 games. If a guy can get 6 sacks playing 80% of the snaps in 9 games, how many sacks can he get playing 100% of the snaps in 17 games? And then when you basically do the math on that, you basically figure if Kaden Ellis was able to get 7 sacks and 20 pressures in 2022 on that workload, in 2023, at least theoretically, if he maintains that same pace, he could get 14 sacks and 40 pressures, basically doubling his production. And so that's why when we did that earlier episode talking about Kaden Ellis, I would make a pretty compelling argument that if I was to bet on anybody hitting double-digit sacks here in Atlanta, and again, I know that's an impossible task. Atlanta Falcons double-digit sack pass rusher, impossible. But if I was betting money on anybody, I would probably throw the most money on Kaden Ellis. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that Kaden Ellis is the Falcons' best pass rusher, because we've been talking all week long about the team's, alpha and sort of who's that guy that's going to get you that pressure or that sack in the fourth quarter when you need it, similar to using a basketball analogy. Who's going to be the guy that you trust to get you that bucket in the clutch in the fourth quarter? And Grady Jarrett is that guy who's that alpha. He's going to be the guy that has the ball last in the game. And we're talked earlier this week about Arnold Ebiketie potentially growing into that player into the future. And Kaden Ellis is not going to necessarily be that guy, even if I would sit here and say he has better odds in both Ebiketie and Grady Jarrett to get the 10 sacks or more. Is basically, to use the basketball analogy, it would basically be like Kaden Ellis is the guy that leads the team in points, right? one of those nights, let's use a Hawks analogy, one of those nights where DeJounte Murray drops, 32 or something like that. But, Trae Young's going to be the guy that's going to get the ball last, right? So Trae Young's kind of the alpha. DeJounte Murray might lead the team in scoring on a couple of nights. And that's going to be Kaden Ellis, where he might lead the team in sacks this year, but he's not necessarily the guy that you're going to in the closing minute to get you that much needed bucket. So, I think that leads to Kaden Ellis having a fairly high ceiling because he has the potential to impact in a major way in terms of the pass rush. Again, double-digit sack guy in Atlanta, it's impossible, right? But, it leads to a lot of questions I think a lot of people have about, him potentially being a quote-unquote one-hit wonder, right? Can you trust that the Kaden Ellis that we're going to get in 2023 and beyond is going to be the same as what the Saints had in the second half of that 2022 season? I think that's a fair question, but personally, I'm not particularly that worried about it. And it's not necessarily because I'm super confident that Kaden Ellis is going to be that guy that reaches that high ceiling, but I'm just pretty confident that Kaden Ellis has a fairly high floor, right? And that comes from watching film. So humble. He's a solid run defender. He's a solid player especially in zone coverage. Now he's not necessarily going to be the guy that you're going to put on an island in man coverage against Alvin Kamara or Aaron Jones. That's more Troy Andersen's type of skill set. But I'm not too worried about that, mostly because in those man coverage situations, I think a lot of those situations are going to be instances where Kaden Ellis is rushing the quarterback in those situations. So I feel fairly good about his floor. Obviously there's a question like there is with Troy Andersen, how high that ceiling is, whether he reaches that ceiling. And a lot of that with Kaden Ellis is going to be determined by his potential to impact as a pass rusher. But I think because if he does, start to approach that ceiling and reach that ceiling, we could be looking at Kaden Ellis as one of the bigger steals of this most recent offseason, right? And you guys know that when it comes to the Fontenot and Smith regime, I've said before that I'm going to hold my applause to the end. Unlike other people, the quote, the late, great Kobe Bryant, so full of basketball comparisons on today's episode. The job's not finished, right? And so, I do think, though, Kaden Ellis has greater potential to be one of those moves that we're applauding at the end, right? Because, he's one of, I thought, a handful of free agents that were available this offseason that have that sort of 10 sack potential, but you're probably getting him for considerably less than what you were able to sign some of those other guys. Marcus Davenport signed for $13 million. We got Kaden Ellis for about $7 million. We'll see what Jadeveon Clowney and Yannick Ngakoue get, as they get new deals, between now and the start of the season. But more than likely, you're probably going to have to spend considerably more than $7 million a year to get one of those two free agents. So again, I think because of that, that makes Kaden Ellis one of the bigger bargains potentially. Again, if he reaches that high ceiling and is a very productive pass rusher that is approaching 10 sacks or whatever, even if that's 7 or 8 sacks, that's still way more than what we're used to here in Atlanta. So we will definitely take a 7 or 8 sack season from Kaden Ellis in that regard. So we'll see whether or not he reaches that ceiling. But even though I have less concerns about the Falcons starters, I do have concerns about the Falcons depth, and we'll talk about Michael Walker, how he factors into that, and the sort of competition for the back end of this linebacker room as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So wrapping up today's Locked On Falcons, guys, I do want to give another shout out to my everydayers out there. And if you make this illustrious podcast your first listen, tomorrow we'll be breaking down the cornerback position, and we'll be talking for once when we're doing these positional breakdowns. We haven't spent a lot of time talking about actual camp competitions, but we'll get to probably one of the biggest ones besides the left guard competition at that nickel cornerback on tomorrow's episode, as well as talk about other topics related to the Falcons corners. But wrapping up today's episode, we'll talk a little bit about the Falcons linebacker depth, starting with Michael Walker, who is a weirdly kind of polarizing player. It's kind of bizarre to me why people have like very strong Michael Walker opinions, good, bad, and all things in between. My sort of Michael Walker take is that he's kind of an ideal backup because of his versatility. He spent the last 2 years playing will linebacker for the Falcons, but he also called the defense for the first half of last year. So theoretically, that could also make him a very effective, replacement level player at the Mike linebacker. And then you go back to his rookie season in 2020, where he spent most of his time playing the Sam linebacker or that strong side linebacker position. You couple that versatility with his value on special teams, especially now with Troy Andersen likely being promoted off of special teams to being a starter on the defense. You're losing a really good special teams player like Troy Andersen was last year, and you want to replace him with a really good special teams player. And Michael Walker was one of the Falcons' better special teams players in his first 2 years in the NFL that he primarily was on special teams. The only real knock I have on Michael Walker is his tackling technique. He tends to play on his heels, and that leads to him missing a bunch of tackles, as we've seen the last couple of years. But other than that, to me, there's not a whole lot to say about Michael Walker. And I don't mean that disrespectfully, and nor am what I'm about to say meant to toot my own horn. But, when we drafted Michael Walker, basically what I said on that episode, breaking down his film, was that if he's starting for, the Falcons in year 3 or year 3 was, of course, last year, it's not likely due to Michael Walker being this great linebacker. It's mostly likely going to be due to the Falcons not really having better options at that position. And that, to me, was exactly the case last year, where the Falcons basically plugged Michael Walker in as a stopgap starter because they didn't really have the money or were willing to spend the money to find a better option. And so therefore, I don't necessarily get why people get so animated about some of these stopgap guys, including Michael Walker, Marcus Mariota, to be as fired up, because they basically serve their purpose of getting the Falcons through the sort of cap purgatory. And so therefore, getting fired up about them, like, oh, this guy's disappointing or whatever, is, to me, whatever. Like, they did their job. Like, they were mercenaries for a year. They did what they were supposed to do, and now we're moving on. So you look at Michael Walker, I look at his 3 years. I wouldn't say they've gone exactly how you would have drawn it up, but he hasn't strayed that far from expectation, at least my expectations, with what his body of work has been over these last 3 years. He's giving you some value as a starter, but he's primarily a backup, and that's kind of what you projected him to be. Now, to me, the bigger concern at the linebacker position is not, are we going to get more out of Michael Walker this year, or what's Michael Walker going to do this year? It's going to be who's going to be the other linebacker, on the team, next to him, who's going to be that fourth linebacker, right? Because especially now when you consider Michael Walker is going to be a free agent after this upcoming season. And I would sit here today, we'll see how it plays out over the next 6 months, but I would not say the odds are in his favor that the Falcons are likely going to prioritize re-signing him next offseason at the current rate. Again, we'll see what changes and develops over the next 6 months, but that opens up a sort of a pipeline or an opportunity for whoever is the fourth linebacker, behind Michael Walker this upcoming season in 2023 to basically be promoted, to the third linebacker to replace Michael Walker in 2024. And to me, the question is, who will that player be, right? You look at the fourth linebacker last year, that was Nick Kwiatkowski, who signed last month with the Pittsburgh Steelers, but that is purely a special teams role, right? And the Falcons brought in 2 special teams linebackers, and Tay Davis and Andre Smith, that have functioned as basically that fourth linebacker with other teams. Davis most recently with the Browns, Smith last year with the Titans, but previously with the Bills and Panthers. And those guys are probably the more proven options, but you also have guys like Nate Landman and Dorian Etheridge, who have kind of flirted with that role the last couple of seasons, both undrafted free agents, Etheridge in 2021, Landman in 2022, that were able to contribute primarily on special teams off the bench in both of those seasons. And if you look at my latest roster projection, from, mid to late June, I did project both Tay Davis and Nate Landman to make the roster as the fourth and fifth linebackers in this group. But for the most part, it is a toss-up. It is an open competition, and you can basically throw 4 names into a hat and pick one of them out, or you could actually throw all 5 names into that, because there is a fifth linebacker in undrafted free agent Mike Jones Jr. that is also in the mix, and maybe he continues the sort of trend of a new undrafted free agent linebacker making the team, making the cut, and contributing this year like Etheridge and Landman have done the last 2 years. Who knows? Based off of what little I've seen of Mike Jones Jr., nothing really stood out to make me feel firmly about that. But comparatively to other undrafted free agents, his path to making the 53-man roster is a much easier path than most guys. Like, even if I was to say, like, let's put a number on it, let's say Mike Jones Jr.'s chances of making the 53-man roster is like 10%, right? For most undrafted free agents here in Atlanta and elsewhere throughout the league, those guys' chances of making the roster is like 5%. So he's basically got doubled the chance, not because he's an especially great linebacker from what I can tell, but simply because the Falcons are so thin at that position. So for me, that fourth linebacker position is going to be something that I'm paying a lot of attention to this summer in camp, in preseason. Again, that's primarily a special teams contributor. But obviously, if that player can also give you some plus value on defense, right, in the event of multiple injuries at the linebacker position where you're forced to play that guy, that's going to be valuable, right? So again, it's a toss up. And, I think because of the unknown nature of who's going to be that fourth linebacker, that has led to speculation from many that the Falcons should or could sign another more proven option at that linebacker position, which makes sense. I wouldn't be against that. I don't think that player should be Rashaan Evans, mostly because Rashaan Evans has almost no experience playing special teams. And I again want to remind you that primarily that fourth linebacker's job is to be a special teams contributor, right? And hopefully, as it was the case with Nick Kwiatkowski and Dorian Etheridge and previous guys, Darren Bates being another example who played like 3 snaps on defense the previous year as that fourth linebacker. Like, that guy's not going to play any defense this year. Hopefully, we'll see. Again, you can't control that, but I don't think you're signing Rashaan Evans to just basically twiddle his thumbs in the event of multiple injuries at the linebacker and giving you nothing on special teams, because, that's not really what Rashaan Evans does, right? So again, I think the Falcons could certainly explore bringing in other guys, but I think for now they can be patient and hope that, a Nate Landman, a Dorian Etheridge, a Tay Davis, Andre Smith, or even a Mike Jones Jr. can, through the power of competitions, earn that spot and earn that trust in training camp. And if they need to address that linebacker position at the end of the summer, they can afford to be patient and wait and see who's available off the waiver wire, because there certainly will be cut made at the end of August that the Falcons may be able to scoop up a couple of guys. So we'll see about that. So there's no rush for the Falcons to worry about their linebacker position. We'll see how it all plays out. But I think that, to me, that fourth linebacker position is much more compelling conversation than, what Michael Walker is going to be. So no offense to anybody out there who has strong Michael Walker takes. I just sit here and I go like, who cares? I don't know. No disrespect to Michael Walker. I just say like, okay. Like, I'm much more invested in that fourth linebacker than I am in what type of season Michael Walker has. That's just me personally, but to each their own is what I will say. So that is going to do it for us here today on the linebacker conversation. Of course, tomorrow we'll be talking about the cornerback position. Again, final thoughts on the linebackers. A lot of potential here, right? Some questionable depth, right? So there's a lot of legit questions about the linebackers, but as I said at the top of the show, like that ain't new to me, at least based off of watching film for the last, decade. Like, it just seems like, yeah, this is par for the course. The Falcons have, major concerns. I guess there's just the difference between this year and previous years is they have no sort of truly proven option. Right. But I think by year's end, we'll see, whether it's Kaden Ellis or Troy Andersen, who's the sort of proven guy. But that's going to do it for us here on linebackers. Tomorrow's corners, talk AJ Terrell, Jeff Okudah as the starters. And of course, who's going to be that nickel quarterback and the competition at the back end. Again, we actually get to talk about a camp competition on one of these position breakdowns. We've just been mostly talking about, like, is this player going to play well? Because the Falcons aren't going into this summer with that many open competitions as they normally have had in previous years and past regimes have had. It's a pretty solidified roster. It's just a question of, how good is this player going to be? Not necessarily is this guy going to make the team for the most part, but we will actually talk about guys that are trying to make the team on tomorrow's episode. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. For your second listen, of course, you can check out the Locked On NFL podcast, and of course the various Locked On Sports Atlanta shows, whether that's Locked On Braves, Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Hawks, ATL Day Ones, and Hitting Hard. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.